Ready? Good morning, everyone. Happy Wednesday. Very glad to see you all this morning. I am so sorry I missed you all last week. I had a little issue, and so I'm very grateful that David Faulkner was able to fill in for me. I hope you enjoyed getting to know him. I know he was great. I listened back to his lesson. He did a great job, so I'm glad he was able to fill in. But I'm also glad that I put down 2 weeks for Ruth, because I would have been really sad to have missed Ruth, one of my favorites. And so today we're going to be looking at the second half of Ruth chapters 3 and 4. We're going to be doing a little recap because I can't stand it. I have to actually do the whole story. And then we're going to be focusing on chapters 3 and 4 today. So a few bits of housekeeping before we kick off. First off, this is the last Bible study of 2025. We will be out for a couple weeks. I hope you have a very happy Christmas and New Year's Day. And then we'll be back together Wednesday, January 7th. So I believe later this week or the first of next week, Bub should be sending you the bookmarks for the spring semester that gives you the schedule digitally. And then we're going to have the physical bookmarks around the church starting around New Year's. And so we will have plenty of those. We come back January 7th. We will be studying Hannah next, and that's in 1 Samuel. And so she will have those schedules to you within the next few days digitally. So if you do not get our emails, then make sure you grab her afterwards. You can give her your email address, and she'll make sure that you have all the information that you need and that you can confirm in writing January 7th. We will be right back here to start the new year together. I think that's all I needed to do before we get started. So let's have a prayer. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Gracious God, in this Advent season, we thank you for giving us a few weeks to be patient and prepare to celebrate once again the birth of your Son. May our hearts and minds be committed to you and open to the way that your Spirit would move through us and into the world, that as we celebrate the incarnation of your word, we can once again be inspired to commit ourselves to live differently and to help bring your kingdom here to earth. Be with all those that we hold in our hearts and minds, those who need extra prayers, especially those who need your healing touch. May they feel our prayers and feel your presence. All this we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, gang. So Ruth is excellent. I love this story. And so I want to put Ruth in a little bit of context first. Going to just do the entire arc of the story front to back so we're all very clear. And then we're going to focus part 2 on chapter 3, part 3 on chapter 4. And then we're going to talk about Ruth's character and how she fits into the grand narrative, God's big arc of salvation. And so first off, we're going to start with just the story so we are all on the same page. Ruth is a story that fits sort of at the end of the period of Judges before we get to the period of the Kings. And so if we remember, we have the Israelites in captivity in Egypt. Moses shows up, they leave Egypt, they go to Sinai, get the commandments, they wander around the wilderness for 40 years, then Joshua takes them into the promised land, and they have this conquest of a big portion of the promised land, but it's not everything. And they kind of settle in. They don't really finish the job that God gave them to do. And because they sort of settled and didn't finish the job, they're still surrounded by a lot of people who are not Israelites. Into that essentially chaos comes the period of the Judges. And the Judges period is chaotic. You've got a lot of people. It's a cyclical kind of story where the Israelites turn away from God and start doing stuff they're not supposed to do, and then they get in trouble, and then a judge comes and delivers them. And it happens again and again and again. We saw that in the story of Deborah. There are many other judges in this period. So after most of that period of the Judges, but before it's totally finished, we have this little story of Ruth shoved in there. And the story of Ruth is really meant to point out the powerful work of God's salvation in the world. And so the story of Ruth has many dynamics, many layers to it. And a few I want to make sure we are very clear about because it's important as it fits into the Christian story. And so here we have, in stark contrast to the violence of the Judges, this very sweet an almost peaceful story where three specific characters are just kind of really good to each other. And it's nice, and there's no gotcha. It's just lovely. And so this story unfolds with three specific people that we have to make sure we know: Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz. And Naomi is Ruth's mother-in-law, and Boaz is one of Naomi's kin. And so it is important to note that Ruth, although the book of Ruth, so it's named for her, she is the key character, and she is a Moabite. And so I want to pause to say, who are the Moabites? It's really critical that we understand where the Moabites fit into this story, because we could just read the story of Ruth, totally skip over the fact that she's a Moabite, and just see she's lovely, and she's faithful, and she's confident, and she's courageous, and she advocates for herself, and then Boaz takes care of her, and they redeem all the loss that Naomi suffered, and nice and clean and easy. If we miss that she is a Moabite, then we miss the primary dynamic of the story, which really is, she is not supposed to have good things happen to her. She is not someone to be trusted. She is a foreigner that is not meant to be a part of the Israelite world. All of this is a dynamic that simply the term Moabite would have meant to people who were reading or hearing this story thousands of years ago, but might be missed on us. So who are the Moabites? The Moabites extend from the son that was born to Lot by his eldest daughter. Now, do you remember the story of Lot? Lot, Abraham's cousin. Lot was in Sodom, and he escaped the destruction of that city, but because his wife was killed and there were no other men around, his two daughters decided to deceive him into sleeping with them to be able to have their own children. So Lot's daughter deceived him. She got pregnant by her father in order to have a son, and that son is Moab. And so the Moabites are the people who are descended from this kind of bastardized branch of Abraham's family. So not directly from Abraham, but from one of his cousins. And they are Semitic, yes, but they are Semitic peoples that stayed in the land of Canaan. When the Israelites went to Egypt, because of Joseph, Jacob and his son Joseph, and they were kind of in Egypt to be secure, the Moabites are Semitic peoples, a branch of the family that stayed in Canaan, which then means that when Joshua brings the people back into the promised land, the Israelites, that these are some of the people, the Moabites, that they are meant to eject from the promised land. But as I noted, they didn't quite get all the job done. So the Moabites hang around, and they're kind of over there, and they can still be bad influences on the Israelites. So into that kind of context comes the first action of the story of Ruth, which is Naomi and her family are starving in Bethlehem. And so they're starving in Bethlehem. There's a famine in the land. They have to leave Bethlehem to try and find enough food for their family to survive. And so they go to Moab. And that is where that's where Naomi's two sons marry Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. Okay, questions about the Moabites and the way that people move around and the dynamics of those peoples, just so we are clear before we get into the loveliness of the story. Good, we're all good with incest? Great, okay. So here we go. Naomi goes off to Moab, and she has two sons. They marry Moabite women, and then promptly both Naomi's husband and both her sons die. So Naomi's left there with Ruth and Orpah. She says, you got to just go back to your own families because there's nothing good for you back in Bethlehem. I have to go back because I'm an old widow. I'm not going to get married again. I'm not going to have any sons again. And so I just am going to go home and hopefully beg and stay alive on the streets. That's basically the way the story goes. And so Orpah says, okay, like reluctantly, she agrees to go back to her family. But Ruth says, absolutely not. And so Ruth has made a commitment to Naomi, and Ruth is going to follow that commitment all the way through. And Ruth then says that beautiful line that was David talked about last week that, people put on coffee mugs, which is essentially, where you go, I'm going to go. And where you live, I'm going to live. And your God will be my God, and your people will be my people, and I will die where you die. I mean, it's this lovely little moment where Ruth is like, I am all in, fully committed. And so Naomi says, okay, you made your bed, so come with me. So Naomi and Ruth come back to Bethlehem. They return to Bethlehem, and they find that essentially the famine is over. Now, this has been minimum at least a decade that they've been gone. And so they get back to Bethlehem, famine is over, and now crops are growing again. I hope it was clear last week that in chapter 2, what Ruth does for her and for Naomi is she follows behind the people who are harvesting the grain. And so there is a really clear command in the Israelite nation, really in the Middle East, where you must allow widows and the poor to make some kind of living. Like, you have to help them. This is not negotiable. And it was an absolute command that any good person would have followed. And so the poor and the widows, they were not someone else's problem. They were yours. They are ours. And so back in this period of time, a way to help widows or the poor is when you harvest in your fields, you kind of let them pick up the scraps. And so essentially, maybe you take the best stuff. Maybe you take the best 95% of stuff, but you intentionally leave things behind so that people like the poor, the widows, can gather up the scraps, so to speak, and eke out a living. So this is not luxurious, and it's not comfortable, but it is a way to help those who may not be able to help themselves. And now in context, I hope it's very clear, but women could not own land. So if women can't own land, they can't grow food. And so there's no other way for them to get the food, because if they can't own land, they can't grow crops, they can't raise livestock, they can't really make stuff. And so there's no way for them to make money to buy food in the market, and they don't have land to grow their own food. So this is about it. This is all they really can do, is they find a nice patch of land and they just scrape together enough to get by. And so what Ruth is doing in this foreign land is following behind the people harvesting the grain in order to pick up the scraps so she and Naomi do not starve. It's into this moment that Ruth encounters Boaz. So Ruth shows up, she's picking up all the scraps, Boaz appears, and he seems like this lovely, generous landowner. He's kind of nice. I mean, the image of the story in chapter 2 is, he's high-fiving all of his employees, and he's checking in on them, and, hugging, kissing babies and stuff like that. And he says, there's this woman here who is needing some food, so just let her be. Let her follow behind. And one thing leads to another, and Boaz discovers that this is the Ruth who has been so good to his cousin, Naomi. And so Boaz kind of clues in that she's the foreigner who's been really good to his family. And so that's essentially how we end chapter 2. Ruth comes back to Naomi and says, I was in the field and this really nice guy, Boaz, helped me out. And immediately Naomi's light bulb goes off and says, oh, Boaz, he's our family. And not only is he the family, but he's the Redeemer. And so we're going to talk about that in chapter 3. Questions about the first 2 chapters? Clarity for anyone? Or something you were wondering about since last week? Yes. What religion did the Moabites practice? It's a great question. In the Middle East, there were multiple macro groups of cultures. And so when I say Semitic, that is a very ancient group. It's kind of like saying you've got Semitic, Persians, Arabs. I mean, these are ancient identifiers of cultures. In those ancient periods, there would have been some overlap in the way that people worshiped. Now, let me preface this by saying religion, as we might define it, we think of as far more formal than it would have been at this point in time. At this point in the ancient world, it's probably what we might consider tribal. It's a bit more like indigenous kinds of ways of understanding the world. And obviously, it all had to do with staying alive. And so if there was good rain and the crops grew strong, there's a god attached to the rain. And there's a god attached to the crops. And then if you hunted really well one day, there's a god attached to the hunt. And there's a god attached to new babies. And there's a god attached, that's kind of the way everyone understood. It was a bit more like what we would understand as perhaps Native American kind of indigenous identities. It's what you see in the Indian subcontinent before the development of what would be described as Hinduism. And so you see this in Central Africa, and you see this in Central Asia. There were all of these tribal groups that yoked their understanding of the world to some sort of deity group. And so the Semitic peoples would have had this overlap of deity understanding, but it would not have been what Abraham's branch understood as Yahweh. And so there is this divergence between the Semitic peoples who stay in the land and the Semitic peoples who go to Egypt. The Semitic peoples who go to Egypt, that we would call Israelites, they're exposed. They have their own indigenous way of understanding deity. Then they go to Egypt, and Egypt has their own grand understanding of deity. And they begin to mix these things together. And what Moses really does is he comes into that and he begins to name a single God. And that's something they remember because obviously Abraham had this idea of God, Yahweh. But while in captivity in Egypt, that sensibility, that knowledge kind of began to morph and merge with everything else that was around them. There was this bit of clarity there for a while, but once they're back in the Promised Land, the Israelites do a similar thing that happened in Egypt, which is they begin to deal and in business and in trade and in travel with all of these other groups like the Moabites. And the Moabites would have had this ancient, more, I can't say anything better than indigenous way of understanding harvest and all these other things. And so it is likely that Ruth grew up in that sort of indigenous tribal way of understanding deity, but also knew what was happening with the Israelites. I mean, remember, the Israelites had come in from Egypt, and they had been quite successful in taking over a lot of the land of Canaan. And so who they were, what they believed, how they lived, that would have been known by all of the other tribes around them, like the Moabites. And so not unknown, but would not have been the tradition she was raised in. But Ruth does have this highly covenantal identity. And so when Ruth marries Naomi's son, Ruth joins herself to Naomi's family. And so even before they travel back to Bethlehem, there is this sense in the story that Ruth has, for lack of a better word, converted to what would have been understood as Judaism. And whether or not she did anything formal, we don't really get that kind of detail, but she definitely seems completely committed to the way Naomi understands the world. And so I think by the time she's back in Bethlehem, although she is technically a Moabite, she's likely committed herself to what we would understand as the ancient Jewish identity. Other questions? Okay. Let's get into chapter 3. So as I said, we've had this moment where Naomi first and then Ruth is aware that Boaz is important to them and that Boaz could redeem them. So just a moment to talk about there's many ways to translate this, like it's a kinsman redeemer. This goes back to marriage laws like the Levirate marriage law that we discussed, 4 or 5 weeks ago, which is if a man dies, then that man's widow should be taken by the man's brother in order to then have children to maintain the dead husband's line. So we went through all of that a few weeks ago. Where Boaz figures into this is you don't stop at brother. I noted that if there are no brothers, then technically the father would be the one who would take the widow and then have children with the widow in order to perpetuate the line. Well, in this case, there are no brothers and there's no father. They all died in Moab. And so then you have this next of kin moment. There is whoever is the closest male relative to the brother-father core family becomes the kinsman redeemer. And in a sense, they are now responsible to take the widow into their household and then have children for the widow and her deceased husband. And so Naomi sees Boaz as that redeemer. She knows that he's the closest to them in the family. And so Naomi and Ruth hatch a plan. And they want to graciously invite themselves into Boaz's house. And so what we see in chapter 3 is Naomi beginning to articulate what she wants Ruth to do in order for Ruth to be taken into Boaz's home. So let's look at chapter 3, and we'll just start right at the beginning. Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, I need to seek some security for you so that it may be well with you. Now, here is our kinsman Boaz, with whose young women you have been working. See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Now wash and anoint yourself, and put on your best clothes, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." She said to her, "All that you tell me, I will do." So Ruth is in. She understands Naomi's plan and is willing to do so. I cannot read this passage without thinking of that Reba McEntire song, Fancy, where, it's like, puts on the dress, like, here she goes, this is your one shot. You got to put on your clothes and then go sell yourself. And so in a sense, Ruth kind of says, okay, I got it. I'm going to clean up. I'm going to put on some good fragrance. I'm going to put on my best clothes. So she's no longer the grieving widow who is taking up the scraps in the field. She's going to go make herself look good and desirable so that Boaz is presented with a good option. This is not meant to be like a prostitution moment. I mean, what I don't want you to hear is that Ruth is somehow doing something illicit or improper. It is proper because we understand these marriage laws where it is meant that the kinsman should take the widow. So there is nothing illegal happening here. But Naomi kind of does understand that it doesn't hurt for Ruth to look good and smell good. So might as well grease the wheels, so to speak. So here we have, say again? Did Boaz and Ruth like each other?
They liked each other from her living at the table.
I think it is possible for us to imply from the story that Boaz was sweet on Ruth. That is not clear in the story. I think we, as romantics, like that. And so when we read the story, we can too easily, unfortunately, what actually happens in the story in chapter 2 is Boaz is nice. And how sad it is that a man is nice to a woman, and we're like, he must like her. No, I mean, maybe. So what I want to say is possibly, but it's been like 10 minutes. I mean, this has not been a long time. It's not like Ruth has been around Boaz for months or years. It's basically been a day or 2 or 3. I mean, this is real tight timetable here. And so could Boaz like her? Sure. I think, though, if you look truly at what the story says, Boaz is actually just an upstanding, honorable person. And to say that Boaz is somehow attracted to or desiring of Ruth, I think is probably reading a little too much into it. He certainly is kind, and he is obviously upstanding in the sense that he wants to protect her. He invited her to dinner. I mean, she's there eating, and so extra generous, for sure. I don't know that Boaz, though, would have... We don't see in the story that Boaz is any kind of improper when it comes to a grieving widow who needs some food. Because when in a moment in chapter 3, what we see is that Boaz just becomes more generous. I do think ultimately we have this implication that they love one another. But, I want us to stop short of thinking of love as always... Not always, thinking of love as only romantic. Because I do think that the love that we see in the Bible most often has nothing to do with romance. It has to do with honor and dignity and safety and security and provision and all of those things. And so I think that for us, I don't want us to go too far into love as a feeling. I think love in the Bible, 99% of the time, love is an action. And so when people show their love, they're taking action for their good. And that's something that, what did I hear? Someone once said, I think it was in a sermon, that true love is what exists when the feelings are gone. And I remember thinking, that's actually kind of compelling, because what we see as love in the agape sense of love, like the Jesus, Christian, Judeo way of love, it's a sacrificial generosity of taking action for the good of another. That's real love. And so I do think that there is love from Boaz and Ruth. But I want us to make sure we understand that it's more the biblical love that is generous and secure and sacrificial, not romantic. Because it's easy for us to hear love and immediately go romance. I don't think that's what we see here. Not really. Yeah.
Why does she tell her to his feet? What is uncover his feet?
Yeah. Okay, so the question is, why uncover the feet? I wasn't going to actually say this to you, but it is very common in the Bible to refer to feet when you're actually meaning the genitalia.
Really?
Yes. So if you want to go there, which is not inaccurate, then when Ruth says, "Go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." Thank you, Sandra, for raising us up so highly. Yes. So if you need that little nugget in your life, there you go. It can also be, you can read this as cuddling. So, it's also just lying together as well. So you can do either or. There you go, depending on your sensibilities. All right, so let me explain what is happening here with the harvest, because it might seem odd, like, what is Boaz doing? Like, where is he? Why is he there? Why is he lying here? So what happens with the harvest is they would bring all of this stuff together in a specific spot, and as they are breaking up the sheaves of wheat or grain, they would break them up, put them in baskets, and they would actually toss them. And when you toss the wheat and the grain, the chaff, the stuff that is useless, is much lighter than the weight of the grain itself. Oh, someone's calling someone because, So as we toss the wheat and the grain, the breeze actually carries the chaff away. And so that's how we clean up the wheat. And so what the people would do after they go out in the field and they gather up all of the grain and they bring it to the threshing floor, to that place where they can process it, they would spend hours like tossing and cleaning it up and keeping in the baskets the good stuff. It's the nuggets that can be ground up and create meal for bread and that sort of stuff. But there is a moment, sometimes just a single evening, where all of that work is just sitting on the floor and it is unsecured. And so owners like Boaz would sleep with it because, of course, thieves are watching. And if you see a field being harvested, you know that there's going to be a moment as a thief where you could potentially steal some good stuff if they leave it unattended. And so what would happen is that people like Boaz, and he's probably not by himself, but the story implies that he's by himself, is they would do all this work. When they were totally exhausted, way after dark, they would eat and drink as a celebration of the harvest. Because remember, this is not just work. This is Thanksgiving. And so these people would have given thanks to God for a great harvest. And they would have done so with a fun banquet. They would have had a little party moment. And then it would have been really late. And Boaz could have been a little tipsy. And then he would lay down with all of the good grain that had been separated from the chaff, sleep there, probably with some animals, in order to protect it overnight from anyone who might steal it. Okay, that's the setup for what Boaz is doing here. Naomi knows this. She knows the process. She'd seen it for years and years. And she knows that an owner and a person who takes very pride in the work he does, like Boaz, would absolutely sleep there. And so she says, here's your chance. And what's lovely about this is that it's actually not meant to be deceptive or manipulative. It's meant to be private. So Boaz, in the way the story is told, is there by himself. And what Ruth is doing is going to proposition Boaz to do the legal thing, which is take her as his wife, but in a way that almost shows him respect and dignity. Because here in private, if he says no, then she can kind of walk away without embarrassing him. He would not have been dishonored in that moment. And so there is this interesting level of both doing it unknown to Boaz in the middle of the night, which is a little deceptive, and also doing it in private so that if Boaz really can't say yes, his honor is maintained. So it is this weird balance of respectful and a little deceptive all at the same time. And so Ruth goes in and she does exactly what Naomi says. She's looking good. She kind of slides under the covers, so to speak, and lays down next to Boaz, who's asleep. And then Boaz wakes up. Let's look at chapter 3, verse 6. So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had instructed her. When Boaz had eaten and drunk, and he was in a contented mood, that's a great way to say you've had a lot to eat and drink. He was in a contented mood. He went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came stealthily and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and there, lying at his feet, was a woman. He said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over your servant, for you are next of kin." So Ruth goes in there quietly, slides in. Boaz is asleep. So I don't know what she's thinking. Maybe it would be all night. Who knows? Or maybe her feet are really cold. And so she wakes him up, which is like many wives and their husbands. And so you've got Ruth sliding in. Boaz wakes up. And then Boaz says, "Who's there?" It's dark. I mean, it's probably no light at all. and he can probably sense there's a woman, especially because she probably smells good. And so, not one of the men. So he says, "Who's there?" And she says, "It's me, it's Ruth, it's your servant." And then Ruth says something interesting. "Spread your cloak over me." And this idea of spread your cloak is something that is relatively ancient. It occurs a few other times in the Bible, like say in Ezekiel, where you see this idea of God spreading the cloak over the people in order to save them. And so what's being used here is this image that's often related to God as the Redeemer or God as the Savior, applied to Boaz in his very specific relationship with Ruth. That Boaz has this capacity, this power and authority to save her. And so she uses this theological language in order to say what is about to happen between Boaz and Ruth is not just two individuals who are following the law. There is something sacred happening here. The theological ripples of what is happening here is not just in the moment, but it's meant to represent something far more significant. And what that moment represents then is connected through time to what happens between God and the people of God. And so we see this resonant in a really powerful way. And this is also kind of a sexually tense moment. And so this is not inhuman. This is also a very vulnerable moment for Ruth, because although she may have assumed because of his actions that Boaz is a good guy, she's also putting herself in a pretty compromising position. What if she had misjudged him? What if the way that Boaz had been generous was actually for ill intent? Ruth is showing up in the middle of the night, presumably by themselves, to lie next to a sleeping Boaz. Anything could have happened in this moment. And it could have been really damaging for Ruth, far less so for Boaz. I mean, we've seen story after story after story where women can actually be damaged, can be abused, can be marked in a sense that then makes it problematic for them to be redeemed later within the culture. And so Ruth's confidence in this moment is certainly in Boaz, but I like to think that Ruth's confidence in this moment is also in her. She is her own person. And yes, Naomi had the plan, but Ruth seems pretty courageously to be just going right on ahead and doing what it takes so that she can take care of her family. And remember that Ruth had this covenant to Naomi. And when they came back, Ruth has consistently done the hard work she needs to do to not only take care of herself, but through her to also take care of Naomi. It's really a lovely relationship between those two, and Ruth is the one bearing that burden. Let's keep looking. Chapter 3, verse 10, Boaz said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. This last instance of your loyalty is better than the first. You have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not be afraid. I will do for you all that you ask. For all the assembly of my people know that you are a worthy woman. But now, though it is true that I am a near kinsman, there is another kinsman more closely related than I. Remain this night, and in the morning, if he will act as next of kin for you, good, let him do it. If he is not willing to act as next of kin for you, then as the Lord lives, I will act as next of kin for you. Lie down until the morning." And so Boaz kind of surprises her. You know, Naomi and Ruth up to this point have thought Boaz is the kinsman. But Boaz says, actually, there's another. And he gets first dibs. And essentially, he gets first right of refusal to take you into his house. Now, you might be thinking, why does someone want the widow? Somebody wants the land. And so Naomi owns land. Elimelech had this land that is still up for grabs. Now, Naomi doesn't own it, but whoever takes Ruth as his wife in order to perpetuate their line becomes the owner of the land that Elimelech owned. And so Boaz is being very honorable by saying, there is another person who is first in line to not only take you as wife, but also to take the entire assets of the line of Elimelech. And so Ruth returns to Naomi, tells her everything that happened. Naomi's quite excited. Questions before we get to chapter 4? Yes?
Okay, I understand about women can't support themselves and all that, marrying their brother-in-law or something. But in this case, she would have Boaz and then he would have her land if they stick together. But that, and he likes her obviously, but, so there's no such thing as romantic love when these couples get together, is it all on a handshake kind of?
So is your question, is there no such thing as romantic love?
Well, in those days, everything seems like so the woman could survive.
Yeah. I do think that there are examples in the stories of people who loved each other romantically too. But primarily marriage is a business deal. I mean, it's a transaction. It's a merger. And so especially if a woman is set to inherit, then it's a big merger because you have a potential husband with land and assets, and then you have a potential wife with land and assets. And if those marriages are done well, then the household expands in its wealth. And so it's a bit nuanced because women represent the ownership of land of their closest male relative. So say, for example, a man has a son and a daughter. Then the father's assets go to the son, not the daughter. So that daughter, if she were to be married, does not pass on the land assets to her husband. She will, if the father has some wealth, be able to pay her husband a very nice dowry, essentially. But it's not land like it would be if a man had a single daughter. So if a man has a single daughter, no sons, then that daughter holds the land, but for her father. She never owns it. But if she gets married, then it's the son-in-law who will inherit from her father. And so she represents a significant amount of assets that could be merged together. So where Ruth is here is she represents Elimelech's assets. She does not own them. And so there is a period of time here where Ruth should be married to a next of kin. It's like statutes of limitations. There's a point at which, if she doesn't, then that land then goes into the family in some other way. And so you kind of have to get married. I mean, it's not like a day, but you can't wait 20 years and not be married, or else those assets go away. And how long is different depending on the time period and the place and all that sort of stuff. But she represents the assets, she doesn't own them. But whoever marries her will then receive them because Elimelech is already dead. So there is no waiting around until he dies to receive those assets. Does that make sense? Okay. So, of course, someone could love and be married, of course. But at this point in time, arranged marriages were very common because it just made sense. And as we've noted multiple times, having children was an investment in security into the future. And so people were not having children because it represented their love. Like that was not it. If they loved each other, bonus, but not necessary.
But you know what? Also, in a way, it saved them if they weren't in love with their spouse because, gosh, he might know that he's living with his brother's wife. I mean, you see what I'm saying? Because,
Well,
well, I mean, well, if he's
so what she said was, if in a loving relationship. It saves them because then the husband wouldn't go be sleeping with other women.
Wouldn't kill her because she wasn't in love with him.
That's really sweet of you. That is not how it worked. Our assumption, it's a great example of how we need to be cautious in placing our sensibilities on top of ancient peoples. So, of course, we think if you really do love someone, you stay true to them. You are committed and covenantal and monogamous and, all those sorts of things. That's a lovely modern sensibility. That is not something in the ancient world that would have meant what we mean. Because again, even the feeling of love is not a limit to what men do. And we've seen that in multiple stories already this year where men kind of just went off and did whatever they wanted and women couldn't. It didn't at the time mean the men didn't love the women, but the standard that you would not sleep with other people because of love, that's totally modern. That's not ancient. And that's real modern, by the way. Like, that's so modern that I'm sure yesterday there were many men who loved their wives who slept with other people. So, it's a little, I don't want us to be too rosy about the way people make mistakes. How about that? I saw something else.
I was just going to say, marriage, putting a romanticism to it at that time, it was about survival.
Yeah, marriage was survival. That's really what it was. And if you had the feelings, great. Certainly some did. Of course they did. And I have friends my age who are in arranged marriages. And they would say, even though the marriage was arranged, they do love the person that they're married to. Some don't. And I think they like them, but it's different because there are still cultures today, modern cultures that are completely with, 21st century, sophisticated and all that sort of stuff, who still do arranged marriages because it's quite sensible. Did you know that in Western established nations, arranged marriages have lower rates of divorce than chosen ones? So just statistically, we can point fingers and we can be like, ugh, arranged marriages. They are more successful than chosen marriages. And why? Well, because who's choosing them for you? The people who really love you and know you well. How many of us have ever had that moment with one of our children where we see them make a choice and we think, nope, that's not what they should do? We know them. We've known them their whole life. And they go off and they make a choice because they're feeling it or whatever. And then we sit back and we think, well, I'm not going to say anything because, good Lord. But you know immediately, that's not going to work out because that's not for them. So extrapolate that to marriage. And I guarantee you, we could fill part of this room with those of you whose children have married people and you've thought, no, it's not good. And so maybe it worked out great, mazel tov. But if it didn't, I bet you knew it wouldn't. And so when you actually put yourself in the position of an arranged marriage, you're not going to make that mistake because you're so invested in what is good for your child, for this person that you love, that you're not going to match them with a jerk who isn't right for them. You're going to match them with a person who really reflects your values. And oftentimes what happens is whole family units come together in a way that is very, what's the best word? Similar, so that the values of the families sync in a way that, the reality is, it's really hard to be married by yourself. You've got to have a community. And if it's not your family, it's got to be someone. And so what families represent in a lot of the cultures, modern cultures who still do arranged marriages, is that's the community that uplifts and supports these two people in their marriage when marriage gets hard. And it's the people who go off on their own, like the two of them can, them against the world, that's when things get really hard.
I think part of it has to do with, I mean, and I do know multiple arranged marriage people who have been very successful in their marriage. I think part of it is they didn't hang out with each other and all that kind of stuff in their culture like ours, where so they have to work harder to make the relationship work. When it's tough, maybe it's not an easy walk away because they do have the family and the respect from their elders who all make the decision.
Well, and marriage is an extension of, I think, some unhealthy cultural identities that we have nurtured. I mean, one of them is you can be anything you want to be. No, you can't. I mean, whatever. That kind of crap that we tell children is horrible. Don't say that to children because it's not true. And, if you work hard and you can do anything. No, you can't. That's not true. And so why would we say things like that? And then we get to the point where it's romanticism upon romanticism, and we read fairy tales to people, and everything's happily ever after, and all this sort of stuff. What that does is that sets us up for a very unrealistic way of life. Life is hard, and life is hard work. And if you actually do not expect that life will be hard work, then when you're faced with the hard work of life, because you always will be, then you think you've been wronged, or that you made a mistake, or that something happened that shouldn't have happened. And then you begin to ask yourself, what did you do wrong? What did they do wrong? What is the world doing? What's God doing wrong? I mean, and then it cascades into this really unhealthy spiral versus just telling people the truth. You can't do everything that you want to do. And life will be hard. Yeah, when you actually have the expectation that is true, then when life gets hard, you're like, I knew it, and I will work at it. And nothing's wrong. It's actually the way it's meant to be. Like, it will be this way. And I think I often put this theologically, that I think Americans expect life to be easy so that when it's not, they feel wronged. Whereas most of the rest of the world expects life to be hard. So when it's not, they're so grateful. And I think if we could flip to this sense of gratitude, man, that transforms everything about the way that we perceive the world. And it also goes into this sense of, where does God fit into this? The story of Jesus as Savior makes no sense to people who don't think they need saving. But when we actually understand that the world is rough and hard and bad things will happen and there are things out of our control that we cannot change, and that we are essentially alone without God, then the saving gift of Jesus makes total sense. And that's why Christianity is growing in many parts of the world, and it's not in places like America. Thank you for the soapbox. Now we will continue chapter 4, so I can actually finish. Okay. So let's close this up with what is really, really most beautiful about the whole story, and that is chapter 4 is about redemption. We have a symmetric arc to the story of Ruth. Chapter 1 is everything falls apart. All the men die, and we end chapter 1 with Naomi changing her name to acknowledge the death and destruction and tragedy of her entire life. Okay, that's the end of chapter 1. When we get to chapter 4, we get full redemption of this. Not only is Naomi redeemed, but Ruth, Boaz, everyone's redeemed. And then we see the implication of that redemption rippling all the way through to the Messiah. And so what I want to do is just kind of read through chapter 4 so we can see how properly Boaz goes about marrying Ruth, taking her into his home. And I'll do it quickly. Chapter 4, verse 1. No sooner had Boaz gone up to the gate and sat down there than the next of kin, of whom Boaz had spoken to Ruth, came passing by. So Boaz said, "Come over, friend, sit down here." And he went over and sat down. Then Boaz took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they all sat down together. He then said to the next of kin, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our kinsman Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me, so that I may know, for there is no one prior to you to redeem it, and I come after you. So he said, I will redeem it. Pause. What did Boaz just do? Boaz is like, I got some juicy land that you could have, and all you have to do is redeem Naomi, the widow. Okay, so this guy says, yeah, I'll do it. Great. Then, verse 5, then Boaz said, the day you acquire the field from the land of Naomi, you are also acquiring Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead man, to maintain the dead man's name on his inheritance. At this, the next of kin said, I cannot redeem it for myself without damaging my own inheritance. So take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. So what he actually said there was, if I take Ruth and we have children, Ruth's children become her dead husband and dead father-in-law's children, and they will receive a portion of my inheritance. Oh, so what he's really saying is, I'm not splitting up my inheritance with some other guy's kid. Boaz, though, not only understands that and has already proven himself generous, confident, honorable, but Boaz knows Ruth. Now, it is not an accident that Ruth is named Ruth the Moabite. Because remember, Moabite is ugly. In this culture, they would have been the foreigner, the other, and nobody wants to associate with them. And so Boaz is being pretty strategic in the way that he sells this sort of moment in front of the elders. Let's keep going. Verse 9. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, today you are witnesses that I have acquired from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, the wife of Mahlon, to be my wife, to maintain the dead man's name and his inheritance, in order that the name of the dead may not be cut off from his kindred and from the gate of his native place. Today you are witnesses. Then all the people who were at the gate, along with the elders, said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you produce children in Ephrath and bestow a name in Bethlehem. And through the children that the Lord will give you by this young woman, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. So we see this redemptive picture happening all together. That these witnesses are giving us all the theological context about what happens between Boaz and Ruth. So not only are they naming that Ruth be blessed like Rachel and Leah, this Moabite woman, they are blessing to be like their matriarchs. But in addition, when the writer of the story wrote it, he says, also, may you be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. Tamar. And so we get in the story of a foreigner a note about the honorable nature of another foreigner. And so the writer of this story is not accidentally bringing up Tamar in talking about how Ruth can bless the people, because they understand. Now, remember when this was written? Way after the action of the story. So Ruth at this point has now come to be understood, and we get it right here, as being key to God's work, key to the work that God is doing to save the people. And so Boaz took Ruth and he became his wife, and together they had a son, and Naomi was blessed for having had this child. And they named the son Obed, and he became the father of Jesse and the father of David. And so before we finish, I want to I've named a bit of Ruth's character. I hope that you have picked up in the reading that Ruth has this beautiful, steadfast love for Naomi. Like Ruth has given her life to secure Naomi's future. It's a really, really generous way to be, self-sacrificial. She is courageous and she is humble. She is willing to work hard. So she comes back to Bethlehem, to a land she does not know, to a people who will not treat her well. And she goes out in the fields and she starts gleaning after the harvesters in order so that Naomi does not die, does not starve. And she has this faithfulness that what should happen will happen. And that faithfulness is then redeemed by Boaz as representative of the way that God spreads his cloak over all the people in seeking salvation. And then we get, as we have done a few times in here, back to the first verses of the Gospel of Matthew, where it's an account of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham is the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Aram, and Aram the father of Abinadab, and Abinadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon, and Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David. And so here this Moabite woman comes in and not only redeems her household, but becomes the great-grandmother of King David. Naomi to Ruth to then David 2 generations later. And then, of course, we know that through the line of David comes Jesus. And so here we have this third woman named in the genealogy of Jesus, and the third woman to be named who, in all reasonable ways, should never have been remembered because she was a foreigner, a widow, someone who was without any family or any inheritance. And yet God's purposes were worked through her. And that's what we get to learn from a story like this, so that when we go into our Christmas services and you hear the birth narrative of Jesus, I hope you remember Tamar and Rahab and Ruth. Merry Christmas, everybody. See you next year.